Okay. All right. Well, lovely to meet you. Could we start off, please, with your name and where you are?
Yes, hello. I'm Michael Randel, and I'm sitting in Kensington, Maryland, which is one of the suburbs of Washington, D.C.
Okay.
I'm in my home, and I'm looking out through my office window into the backyard where we're very lucky to have a small forest behind us. So it's just a field of trees, which at the moment it's mid-December, so the trees are bare.
No snow
But
then?
no snow,
Okay.
no.
All right. So, as I think you know, the first big question is who are you as a human being? And you can frame that however you want from the present. You may want to speak to some of your values, some particular features or qualities of yourself, whatever you'd like.
Yeah. Um, so I think the one thing that I will just name that comes to me is I'm an introvert, right? Because I notice when I get questions like that, I tend to look to the side as I'm thinking about how do I want to respond to it. So that's a big piece of me, which is I'm a person who observes a lot, thinks and reflects, tries to make sense before I intervene, before I speak, before I act.
Hmm.
And I'm a, in one way, I'm a straight, middle-aged white male, middle class with a university education. I have English as my first language, and so I know that brings me a lot of privilege in the world that we live in today. I'm a husband. I'm a father of two teenagers. I'm a son, and I'm a brother with my sister and younger brother. So I'm the firstborn of our family.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, and it's interesting. I kind of think of that relatively small set of named people as my family because that's how I've grown up.
Okay.
Um, my father, his professional work took him to different countries, so we moved um, every few years, and so my experience. Um, I was born in Ireland. My family is Irish, so my father and mother were back in Ireland from a previous assignment, and they lived in Ireland for a few years, during which time three kids were born. And then when I was 4 years old, we moved to Ecuador.
Okay, that's a switch.
Yeah, because my father had this assignment working with the Ecuadorian government, doing a geological survey of all of Ecuador.
Okay.
So when we moved, it was just the five of us. After 3 years, we went back to Ireland for a year, and we lived in a small town in Ireland, which is where my grandparents were living at the time, and my aunt and uncle and their kids, so my cousins. So I had this 1 year of experience of living in a town where I was in community with my extended family. And then from there, we moved to South Africa. Again, just the five of us.
Again, a very big switch.
Yeah. And um, yeah, so then I completed my schooling in South Africa. We were living in a small town, went off to university. And then, in a sense, I was by myself through my 20s, essentially. Um, and then I made another move and I moved to the United States um, to be with the woman who I had met and fallen in love with and married eventually. But kind of came here. And so I've now been living in the United States for almost 24 years,
Hmm.
which is the same period of time that I was in South Africa for,
Hmm.
um, which is an interesting kind of paralleling that's been going on there. And, we live here in Washington, D.C. with our two kids, but it's the four of us, right? My parents are still in South Africa. My sister and brother are now living in London, in UK. And my wife's family live in Florida, but also in Germany. So there's a sense, there is an extended family, but for me, it's always been the nuclear family is my experience of my sense of family.
And what about your sense of yourself with all of these different parts?
Yes, well, that's been my work of integration,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so one of the things is in all of these moves, there's been a bit of a sense of being adrift, like looking for where's my home, where's my mooring. And I don't know for how long, but for a very long time, my answer is, my home is where I live now. It's not somewhere else. It's not where my parents are.
Mm-hmm.
It's not where I grew up. It's where I am now is my home. So that brings me a form of stability that works for me, that I don't have a yearning back to somewhere or to be somewhere else. I'm here and now. So by coincidence, I bump into a nice Gestalt concept, just being in the here and now. So there's a part of my story, and again, it's one of the things I'm working on integrating, which is I've sort of traveled by myself this path around the place. And in recent years, the work I'm doing is more about integrating and connecting with family, connecting with colleagues, connecting with friends, and not feeling alone, not experiencing myself alone, but experiencing myself as part of these communities.
And that's a difficult balance. I mean, I can identify with some of that, not quite to the same extent, maybe of the reach of your story, but that the am I alone, and sometimes in practical terms, yes. In relational, emotional terms, maybe not. But it's a difficult idea for me, that idea of, am I alone or am I actually connected?
Right.
Because the physical body may have nothing to do with that sense of connection.
Right. And I have a wide network of friends, colleagues, all over the place. So a lot of the people that I work really well with don't live in the same country as me, don't live in the same time zone as me. And so, on one hand, thank goodness we live in this day and age where, particularly with WhatsApp, it is so simple and easy to stay connected, to partner, to laugh together, to learn together, to work together without needing to share physical space. Right. So I love being able to pay attention to and stay connected with different people. And it takes work, sometimes, particularly with people that I don't have, I'm not working with on work projects, right? So I've got to then remember and reach out to others and stay in touch with them. But I enjoy being able to do that.
Yeah, it's definitely the intentional cultivation of relationship. That's a whole skill set.
Right. Right. And then, what I'm also working on is around how do I become more grounded in my physical geographic community. Right.
How's that going?
We're making progress. We're making progress.
Sometimes I think it's a little bit trying to develop a local identity is sometimes like trying to put the toothpaste back in the tube once you've squeezed it all out.
Well, there's different things that go on. I mean, so I'll make one little example, so in the United States, children are driven to school on these big yellow buses, which I didn't have that experience growing up. I had to ride my bicycle or walk, whatever it was. So for several years, we had this bus stop community. There would be the neighborhood pickup point, which was about a block from our house. we'd all come out with our little children at a certain time of the morning, and the parents would chat around as the kids got on the bus. And there were a number of like social gatherings that happened, the bus stop gangs getting together. So that was an identity of being, father, parent of a young child. And so we had that thing in common. But then as the kids got older and we stopped as parents going with them to the bus stop, they could go by themselves, that community dissipated, right? Because that connection of young children at the bus stop didn't translate beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
And so this actually comes back to another one of my things about who I am, which is, I don't want to overuse a word. The two words that came up, and neither of them are right, are migrant and nomad.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm not either. But I think I've also had this experience of moving and entering different societies to live in them, but come from somewhere quite outside and different from that society. Right. And I'm sort of the only one with this identity. So I'm a different being in that space.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, as a child, it wasn't very easy to make connections. One of the stories I remember, when we moved to South Africa, I was 8 years old. Right. And so just for the moment, if you picture it, in the previous 12 months, I had been at an international school in Ecuador.
Mm-hmm.
Then I'd spent a year in Ireland, and now I'm in South Africa. And so I'm asked the question of, are you bilingual? And my answer is, yeah, English, Spanish, Irish, because I learned a little bit of Irish when I was at school there. And now I'm here learning Afrikaans. So that would be 4. I said, no, but you're not fluent in Afrikaans. So therefore you're not bilingual. Because the framing was bilingual can only mean English and Afrikaans.
Mm-hmm.
Spanish,
It's
Irish,
like currency. I mean, you bring currency from another place and it's useless.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, going through the school, through to high school, I had that sort of experience of being an observer, trying to find ways to connect with medium success. But then I think going off to university for me was liberation.
Mm-hmm.
Going from this small town that was very insular, very conservative. This was, early mid 1980s South Africa. So apartheid was in full force. So I went off to university, and university was like this explosion of color and flavor. People were talking about and working on issues of social change, anti-apartheid resistance, being the particular thing that was in focus. The students were, I want to say, almost all South African. Some of the faculty there were a few non-South African faculty, but many of them had experience doing higher degrees abroad. So there was much more of a global awareness coming into this.
Mm-hmm.
So there was that sense of, for me, it felt a little bit like reconnecting to my roots of a bigger stage. And so that was a fascinating journey and experience. But the other thing that was really interesting was I went to the university in 1986. Right. So this was the University of Natal, in a city called Pietermaritzburg. So it was a medium-sized city. The university had about 3,500 students. So it was actually a very nice size. But 1986 was the year the university began to admit Black students, right? In defiance of the law. The law said education is separate. The liberal universities had said, actually, we're no longer going to abide by that law. And so the 4 or 5 of them had begun to admit Black students. So I spent several years at the university. And so basically from that year 1 with this like tiny, tiny number of Black students, I was there for 8 years doing a couple of postgraduate degrees. And by year 8, the percentage of Black students had risen to 35%, right? And I don't know what it is now, but it's probably 80, 90%, I would imagine, in today's university. But this was a huge social, cultural disruption in the campus. You know, there were sort of broadly three groups among the students. There were the naive, innocent white school kids like me who'd just come straight from school, now we're at university, and here's the big world, and these things are happening. There were these Black students coming in, many of whom were a bit older because it had taken them longer to get into university, the education had been disrupted, or to get funding. So many of them were like 20 to 25, as opposed to 17, 18, where many of these white high schoolers were. And then the third group were these white men, I'm going to call them, who had just completed 2 years compulsory military service. And at that stage, compulsory military service meant a high likelihood that you were fighting a war in Angola and in Libya, army of occupation. And that was a war that was framed in the apartheid era as, you know, keeping the communists out of South Africa, keeping South Africa white and Christian. So we're going to fight in Angola, and we're fighting against the Cubans, who are the Russian proxies. And so that was a very intensive, very real war. And they would have demobilized in December, and the first week of February, they're now university students.
That sounds like a powder keg.
Right. And oh, by the way, the dormitories are also being racially integrated. Right. And like nobody's got any experience of this because everything in life up to that point in South Africa has been racially segregated.
Yes.
And
you put it in that age group their entire lifetime.
Right. And there were no formal mechanisms to help people bridge, help people understand this is what's going on. You know, the couple of people that I could remember doing a little bit about something about this in my first and second year were some of the people in the psychology department, right, who'd had some international experience and had some of the skills to see what was going on and to try and bring some support. But it was potential for powder keg, potential for lots of conflict and misunderstandings and all the rest of it. So yeah, I mean, that was the beginning of my apprenticeship in learning about change and working with change in people and in groups.
And how did it actually go? Because it had the potential, but you're here, it sounds like the university did not blow up.
Not at that point. Yeah, there were some things that happened after I left, which I have no responsibility.
Okay.
So as far as I can recall, and I might be wrong on this, but I don't believe there was physical conflict.
Okay.
I'm quite sure there was a lot of racism and aggression towards people of color from particularly conservative white students, but also from just middle of the road, unknowing white students who would have engaged in what we would now call microaggressions. Right. And it was really interesting because over these 8 years, the very small number of Black students were sort of trying to join into the existing infrastructure, student clubs, societies, and things like that. And the framing from the white side is, oh, you're welcome. Right? We don't mind that you join us. Right. And particularly at that time, I was involved in faith-based groups. So kind of working from the church side. And, you know, there was this sort of liberal, oh, yes, you know, we're all one. Come and join us. We don't mind. Here's how we do things. You know, here's how we sing our songs with us. Right. And so that was the sort of the first big point. Then it kind of a little bit more awareness of, oh, you have a different way of worshiping. What are some of your songs? We don't mind having one or two of your songs in our structure.
Mhm.
right? Um, and then when the Black student numbers grew large enough, they withdrew
Mm.
because there were enough of them to be their own group. So it was interesting. I don't think the Black Student Society, as it was called, was formed until about the third year I was at university,
Mhm.
right? So there was this interesting thing that was like the Black students. So the pushback became, we don't want to have to join in your way of doing things because they don't work for us. We're not comfortable with them. We have our own way of doing things. And if you're not giving us the space to bring that into where you are, we're going to come and do it over here with ourselves.
Right. I mean, it's the difference between integration and acculturation.
Right.
Hmm.
Yeah. So there was sort of contact at the margins,
Mhm.
but then I would suggest by about year 4, 5, 6, they were more in parallel.
Mm.
And this also coincided with the changing political environment. So 1990 February was when Nelson Mandela was released from prison and the political organizations were unbanned. It transformed the notion of what was South Africa. Right? It took 4 more hard years before we had the elections and a new democratic government. But Black students, I think, began to feel it's on our side now, right? It's going to happen. It's inevitable. Whereas through the 80s, it was a very, very dark, very hard time. And there was a lot of, will it ever happen? Despair. We had a huge amount of political violence around the city of Pietermaritzburg.
Mhm.
Uh, Hundreds of people being killed in political fighting. And so that weighed down on the move. And that continued for quite a few years. Um, so yeah, so sort of that was my learning about, not quite understanding, but being in the experience of it. And then I had the great fortune of joining a group which was called the Student YMCA. So it is a YMCA branch that had been founded specifically to be on campus. So
Mhm.
it wasn't a big dormitory building, it wasn't a gymnasium, it was a student organization, but professionally staffed. And so the staff person in Pietermaritzburg, who had just founded this a year ago, was a man called Trevor Gorvin. He was probably 10 years, 15 years older. So he'd had experience and he'd traveled abroad and he came back with skills to see what was going on and to help bridge some of these divisions.
Mm.
And so I joined that group and got involved in leadership and basically was mentored by Trevor over several years, learning not to not just accept, that people are apart or that we want to only simply invite in people, but rather we're working on social justice. We want transformation. We recognize that our own patterns and things are ours, but they're not everybody's. So we're open to exploring and changing and learning together.
Hmm. And so, how does that context, that period in your life, and those experiences affect you? How does that shape you or influence you?
It set me on my life's path. Um, Before I started at university, my last year of high school, my mother took me to the big city to spend a day of doing vocational testing. What should Michael do with his life? What should he study at university? So this day-long thing, and sort of in a sense outspits the result. Michael should become an industrial organizational psychologist.
That's pretty specific.
And I said, what the heck is that? I've never heard of that. I don't know anybody who does that. I've got no idea what the work is. I want to go and study English and history. And so I said no to the psychology. I did my, arts degree in English and history. And by year 3, so the final year of my degree was a 3-year degree, I was involved in the YMCA, had been at the university level, but I'd gotten involved in some of the national dialogue that was going on in the YMCA, which was a very conservative organization, apart from the university spots, and very, very divided racially. And there was a big effort to change that. And so I essentially got to be on the sidelines of this organizational change process, and then became quite involved in it. And so that was probably over an 8 or 9 year time span. And one of Trevor's colleagues in the YMCA was a man called Steve Hobbs, who was an industrial organizational psychologist by profession. You know, he worked in a company doing that work, but he brought that skill set to the YMCA change work. So he became another of my mentors. And so I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I like that. I'm drawn to that. But I'm already on this track of English and history, and I can't afford to start again. Right. I can't go and do another degree. So I have to kind of stay on this educational track, but have this side interest.
Okay.
And so I've begun to think about that really as an apprenticeship. Because, you know, I started off with very small groups and then slightly bigger groups. And then, you know, I would be the co-facilitator of a session. And eventually there were points where I was the facilitator. And I think it was probably I'd probably be doing that kind of work for, I want to say, at least 8 years before I ever attended a facilitation skills course.
The humanities parts of me just wants to defend that English and history are not entirely unrelated. I mean,
No, not at all.
The narrative skill set, the contextual awareness. I mean, these are things.
Yes. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
No, they're really important. Yes. You know, I mean, for me, my English studies, because what I then did was postgraduate study in English literature. It's about the ability to ask questions and explore for answers.
I was going to say, is it about the ability to hear voices? Not in a schizophrenic way, but in an aesthetic, in a sensitive, you know.
Sure. Yeah, and a lot of the reading that I was doing, I was looking at post-colonial literature. So I was reading literature written by people of color about post-colonial societies, right? So that also took me out of this only South African experience and was looking at primarily the Commonwealth because it was English language literature, but being aware of what were the kind of experiences people were having in these other places. And I was particularly looking at the literature of travel. You know, people who would travel and then write about their travel experience. So you've got the writer as the observer, but also the narrator, you know, and their experience of being in a country.
Not at all related to your personal experience in projection at all. Yep.
So yeah, so yes, I don't regret my studies. They were also very helpful. And, you know, for a while, I'm aware that had I studied industrial psychology, organizational psychology, there would have been a rigor that would have been developed in me in my professional practice now. So my rigor has taken a different route. Right. So I'm not you know, can't even think of some of the words now, but you know, I'm not using surveys, you know, deeply analytical surveys, and I'm not using like work study skills. I'm sort of working in different ways with rigor and robustness, but it's a different kind of skill set to work on change.
Yeah, it sounds like something a mature student would do instead of, you know, a 20-year-old playing dress up and applying tests.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So at the beginning, you mentioned, you sort of did the very social location, thing of I am this, this, this. I'm curious, how do you understand some of those aspects of yourself at this point, having gone through all of these different iterations and points of contrast? I mean, one of the ones I often ask about is how you understand yourself within your gender or masculinity or as a man. I mean, that's one of the ones you named. Is there anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, so my sense of masculinity is tied up in my identity and in my awareness of privilege, right? So if I think of myself as a straight, white, English speaking, university educated, middle class male, you know, I'm up there,
Hmm.
right? I've got, all sorts of privileges that most people in the world don't have. And undoubtedly, there are ways in which I am bound by them and I have blind spots in relation to them. And I think the silver lining on my kind of early experiences of nomadism, right? Entering different societies, um, being able to compare to other places where I've lived, what's going on here now, have from a sort of an early age um, made me aware that I have privileges, right?
Hmm.
It's not something that I've only had to come to in my 30s or 40s. I've carried that awareness for a very long time. Um, I had, after my YMCA experience, which was about eight years or so, one of the things we were working on there, by the way, was around gender integration into the YMCA, right? And why is it being called the Young Men's Christian Association?
Hmm.
Why can't we go to the Young People's Christian Association? Because there were youth being served were men and women, and part of the transformation of the South African YMCA was to go from these, in a sense, out of touch, old, poor condition residential dormitories to something that was relevant to the youth of South Africa,
Okay.
which in the early 1990s was around education, social justice, sexual reproductive health, HIV and AIDS. So there was a really, really interesting work that began happening at that really ground root level that was not about um, men only. It was about we're working with the youth and here's the youth, right? So the big shift had been we're prioritizing Black people
Hmm.
and we're not trying to do it in a way that we're trying to do and also white people. It's like, no, the youth are the majority of the population. These are where the biggest needs are. That's where we're going in on. So, even then in the early day, we had a very probably simplistic way of thinking about gender and gender equity. But certainly there was no question that there will not be women involved in who we program with, in who we're hiring as staffing, and slower in our leadership,
Hmm.
right? So that's been there. As I was leaving the YMCA and then going into more regular work, um, actually, I realized this now. From I had, I guess, almost 8 years, three different roles, and every one of those leaders I worked with was a woman. Two of them were very effective. One of them was for a year. She was a good starting point. The one in the middle um, was also learning to be a manager, so it wasn't quite as sort of the mentoring role. But then the next 5 years was with another very strong woman leader. So I had very positive experiences of woman leadership um, that helped me, also learn about myself and working on myself. And it wasn't, it wasn't just about getting on the career ladder and going from there. It was very much around a humanistic approach, whole people, whole society. So I had those really powerful early experiences, which, again, I don't think I had a lot of language for it at the time. It intuitively felt right. I saw the contrast of that style of leadership towards a more sort of masculine, toxic styles of leadership, hierarchical leadership, and I could see that this is where I wanted to be. And then with time, I've come to understand more about what was going on and why it worked for me, why it's good for society, and to really advocate and espouse those styles of leadership.
And I think that's sort of my next question is, you've talked a lot about leadership, which to me speaks to power structures. So how have you come to understand your relationship with power, using it, experiencing it?
So I think, again, it comes back to the sort of early South African experiences that I had, where power was fully vested in the apartheid government. Power was in white people. Power was in the apparatus of the state. So the police force, in particular, the military as agents of power. So, one of the things I remember in our early YMCA work, in the South African context, the cities were traditionally white areas in the apartheid period, and they were sort of surrounded by black areas that were called townships, right? Black people were not allowed to live in white areas. They were kind of relegated, if you will, to these areas with fewer services, poor housing conditions, et cetera, et cetera. So from our university YMCA, we partnered with a YMCA in the township of Edendale nearby. And they invited us to work with them on sort of Saturdays, come over as a sort of work program, helping to build creches, childcare facilities for infants. So we would take a number of students, and on a Saturday morning, we'd go into the township and we'd meet with some of the YMCA members, black men and their families, and we'd work side by side, building a creche. And it would be quite common that the police or the army would drive past and stop and look at what we were doing, because technically it was illegal for us as white people to be in the township.
But not as illegal for people to
Right,
cross.
but they're not going. But because they could see that what we were doing looked innocent, right? I didn't have an experience of them coming and intervening, but there was certainly that experience of them driving past and slowing down. Right, so there was that sense of the state's power and what it could, right? In the sort of late 80s, as the protests against apartheid really got stronger and stronger, there was more clashes between the university and the police, right? And so there'd be a protest march leaving the campus, which was a kind of a really safe space. As soon as they got through the gates, they would be met by the police with their shields and all the rest of it. And again, so with that sense of the police as this power that will suppress and wants to deny justice. So I think that's an early framing, so one is like, I'm on the side of the people fighting for justice. So that's my sense of power. That's, nice privileged thing to be able to say. I'm aware that maybe it's a bit ironical. But also the sense that power is malevolent, the right word? It sort of has an evil, destructive element to it, right? That if it's not checked, it can become quite violent and forceful. So kind of sort of being aware of that and working against that kind of power, right? And then with time, learning there are good kinds of power, right? And so, yes, there's obviously lots of examples of working for good, mobilizing the power of people, power of the community to bring about change. So I think, I'm in this really interesting place where I've been essentially a change consultant for 35 years, I guess it is.
Mm-hmm.
I was employed in different places for probably the first 15 years or so. And I've been self-employed with my own practice and business for the last almost 20 years.
Hmm.
But in those times that I was employed, I was never a formal manager. And one of the things that I don't necessarily say openly to my clients, but I don't mind if they see this, is I've never managed anybody formally.
Mm-hmm.
I've never hired anybody. I've never
They can
fired anybody.
project that onto you, but you've never actually done it.
Right,
Mm-hmm.
right. I've observed lots of that,
Mm-hmm.
right? But as if I've never had that sort of institutional, organizational power vested in me
Mm-hmm.
to be
The
part of this.
knighting process and the mm-hmm.
Right, right. But I've been managed.
Mm-hmm.
So I've experienced good managers and less effective managers
Mm-hmm.
over time. I've learned a lot from that experience, right? And so, I see how people engage with power within organizational structures, which is where I'm primarily working. And so one of the ways that I use my privilege to try and shift power is partly realizing that sometimes there's things that I can say and do as a white male that are not as easily available to the women who I'm with, to necessarily to people of color, things
Mm-hmm.
like that. So there can be ways that I can say something and will say something and will do something to create an opening so that something has been uttered, now it's on the stage, or an opening that others can then join and elaborate and extend, right? I'm not necessarily going to say something that's necessarily speaking from my own experience, but I will be able to say, I noticed that, I'm curious about, right? And I sometimes use it as very intentionally as my sort of voice of the naive,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, I don't understand this. Explain to me how it works, right? To have somebody bring out how they don't understand how it works, or that it's a very overly complicated system, right? So I'm not coming in to critique to say you have a very complicated system. I'm just saying, tell me again, or
Right. And you can say that about something which is utterly dysfunctional and unjust, or you can say it about much smaller levels of questioning.
right. So I can say and have said things like, I'm aware that the people who speak first every time a question is asked are white people or are men, and and I'll say this in groups that I'm part of, as well as in groups that I'm hosting and facilitating, right? So that's really where I do, I guess, have a lot of power, is in group processes. How I design them, how I host them, how I manage them. And again, there's things I miss. I have blind spots, but seeking to do it in a way to bring more equity, to ensure that all the voices are given an opportunity to be heard, because not everybody necessarily wants to speak, but to create the space that they're able to if they wish to do so.
Okay. And, a lot of this language, maybe I just hear some of the Gestalty veins in it, but I will openly ask you, where did Gestalt come into this? Because I don't think it was in the middle of that university transformation phase. Like what happened?
Came a little bit later, and it's actually really interesting. I remember it very distinctly. Chantal Wiley calls me one day. We were friends back in Durban in South Africa. This was 1995. And said, I've got this opportunity to go to Europe to be in this international Gestalt program. It sounds really interesting, and I think I'm going to take up this opportunity. And I said, it sounds really interesting, but what's Gestalt? But it was about, organizations and systems change. We thought that's fantastic. So we had so who was we? I should say that. At that point, I was working in a non-profit organization. It was called Olive, founded by an amazing woman called Davine Thor. And so she was the woman leader I worked with for 5 years, who had a very, very positive, strong effect on me. So she had set up Olive to do organizational change support to nonprofits during the political transformation in South Africa. So 93, 94 period was founded. And there was a very strong emphasis on learning and learning from each other. So Chantel went off for the first week of the 5 weeks of that year-long program. She came back, and I remember a group of us, I can't remember, probably at least a dozen people, Olive practitioners and some others, gathered in Davine's home, and Chantel said, "Let me tell you what I've just experienced." And we either had 2 half days or 2 days of something, but sitting with Chantel after that first week of experience. And we're like, wow, it changes the way we think about how we do our work. Right? Up to that point in my experience, I had, in a sense, been learning how to facilitate. I'd never done a course on it, but I'd been learning how to facilitate by drawing a lot on adult learning practices, right? Where there's a lot of community-based, group-based things, how you present to people, how you get small group discussions going, how you debrief and things like that. So lots of sort of small group animation. And I had been approaching it in a way that was a little bit technical, in the sense of these are the ingredients and you put them together and then you have a process. And Gestalt isn't that, right? It doesn't wash away some of the technical steps. You can still use them, but you're using them in a different way, from a different orientation.
And what is that orientation for you?
I think in my early days, I'm guilty of facilitating workshops and things to get the group where I wanted them to be.
Okay.
There was an outcome, and boom, 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 I'm going to do these things to get them to there. And I think what Gestalt brings me is more honoring of the group and its process and what it wants. Right? And that's not always what either I want. So I do less of that now as a consultant, but it may not be what the client wants, the sponsor wants. So how do you negotiate different expectations, different needs in groups, but also then be able to help a group see for itself what it wants, what it's willing to work on? I think, so the Gestalt has given me, I'll use the word liberation again, liberated from, I have my agenda that I must follow, to I have an agenda as a guide. Let's see how far we get with it. Right? Sometimes we've gotten to purpose. And then, no, that doesn't work for us. And so everything else after that gets abandoned and we have to redesign on the fly with the group. So if you're here, here's the work you want to do, let's do that work then, not that throw up the agenda. But it is a much more nimble, agile way of working that's very much clued into the here and now, as we say, that can be responsive to that. So that was my kind of first taste of Gestalt, and it was wonderful. Over the coming months, we had started at Olive a training program with some funders supporting it to train people in project planning skills. Okay, so it's not like hardcore traditional project management, project planning stuff. This was in a context where 1994, 95, this was 95 now. Everything's changing in South Africa. All the donors are coming in and saying, we want to support transformation. We want to support civil society. And the way that we do that is we need you to fill in these structured project plan templates. Tell us what your objectives are and your outcomes and your outputs and your activities and your budget. And then give us that plan and we'll support you. And this was completely different to anything anybody in South Africa had experienced, because anti-apartheid resistance is you move, you organize, you find opportunity, you do things. You don't have a right. The rest of the world operated with plans. South Africa didn't. Now we had to join the rest of the world. So what we were doing was building the capability of nonprofit practitioners and leaders to understand the planning process and to develop plans in this methodology to meet this need, even though there was a lot in which we felt it doesn't quite fit. Right? This is not developmental in its orientation. So we very quickly realized that learning about the method and how to run sessions to develop plans, there's a key piece about facilitating that's important, and how you do that. And so one of the people that Chantal had met in this Gestalt program was Jochen Lohmeyer, who is now her husband and has been for many years. And Jochen's specialization was project planning, facilitation, and integrating Gestalt into that. So Jochen then came and worked with us a few times, and we would have these week-long learning experiences where we're learning how to facilitate the planning process. So we're technically learning to understand the planning structure, but we're also learning how to facilitate. And there was Gestalt infused in that from the start.
Sounds a little bit like learning to be sort of a translator or interpreter of two completely different language structures.
Yeah. So I think we had the good fortune that we had Jochen, who had the long experience in training, facilitation, project planning, who could see the potential of Gestalt and integrate it in. We had Davine as a very seasoned, wise leader who got the planning methodology, but also got community change, community development, social change. And so they had the experience to be able to bring that so that novices like myself could begin learning all of those different languages, if you will. Right? Clumsily, not elegantly, but knowing that it's not just one language. There are, as you say, multiple languages that we're trying to bridge here in a community-based or organizational-based planning process.
And so what have you come to do with all of this collection of skill sets and languages and experiences?
Yeah. So what I did was I spent the 90s in South Africa doing this work, social change, primarily working with nonprofits, but some public sector work. I moved to the United States in the year 2000 to join my girlfriend here, and we got married a couple of years later. So when I first came here, I worked for about 10 years with the World Bank. And that was a fascinating experience. Because, I'd been working in South Africa. I had been doing more and more work in other parts of Africa and even Southeast Asia. So we, had this bit of a bigger exposure. I knew it was more than just South Africa was going on. But then the World Bank's, oh yeah, we have offices in 140 countries. We've got 25,000 staff. We're working across 24 time zones. So the scale of it was blew my mind. And I was working there on internal organizational change, leadership development. So in a way, I had my second apprenticeship, which is working at large scale and working global. Right. And my first apprenticeship served me well, but they were very, in a sense, I guess we would call them they were very intimate types of skills, working with groups in the room. Now we're trying to do that online.
Hmm.
with multiple languages. So, that was a great experience. 10 years, I learned a lot from all of that. And then I went independent. And so, yeah, I guess the last 15 plus years, because there was a little bit of an overlapping period, but the last 15 years, I would say I've been an independent practitioner. I run my small business. And the path has been sort of going from taking on one person assignments,
Hmm.
facilitating meetings and retreats and things like that, to working on more complex social and organizational change. Um, so, I've had a number of projects where the client has been a foundation that's bringing together a portfolio of grantees, right? So, in one case, that was a foundation that brought together the leaders of all the different Montessori organizations in the United States,
Okay.
which were deeply, deeply divided and had been for more than 50 years or 60 years. And this is now 2010. And are we really still talking about something that happened in 1960? Yes, we are. Okay. Well, how do we begin
Hmm.
to move forward? Because this was the Obama administration. So there was this opportunity of we can bring more developmentally appropriate education and expand it to communities of color and underprivileged and things like that. So I got invited in and worked for about 8 years with these leaders to bring sort of alignment and coherence in what they were working on. And so they ended up calling themselves the Montessori Leaders Collaborative. And, the organizations worked more in partnership. They were able to raise new funding that had not been available to them because they were so small and scattered. And so it was really a sort of a transformational experience there. That was a lot about group facilitation, but not just as an event, but as a process of change. And I learned a lot from that. I've done other kinds of things that are large systems change. But these days, I'm doing a lot of work that is at the level of organizations, at the level of leadership teams. Um, yeah, and I must also say that when I had that early exposure to Gestalt in the mid-90s, so I carried that with me for a long time. There was a couple of key concepts that I remembered and worked with, but then I didn't get any more formal Gestalt training until 2014. And that's when Chantal told me that they were, because she was on faculty for these programs at that point, they were launching this new program called iGold, the International Gestalt Organization and Leadership Development Program. 18 months, 5 weeks, each module a week long in different countries. So it was global, it was cross-cultural. It was about going into places of being unfamiliar and finding ways of working with a global faculty and a global student body. So that was,
Seems to profile well for you.
yeah, it did. And it was very, very powerful learning.
Mm-hmm.
And it was transformational for me. Because it was the place that confronted me with how much everything I did came from here, right? I could be very analytical. I could analyze, I could make sense, I could design very clever processes, I could facilitate well, but it's all technical, right? I was very driven by competence. And this had to do with some of the early story about how do I find my place? How do I get taken seriously and credible, right? So, I was that 21-year-old who was leading things because, hey, I'm in the room and I'm taken seriously, right? My age doesn't matter because I'm competent. And so, yeah, so that began to get dislodged through this iGold experience. And, yeah, so that shifted me. And in addition to the powerful teaching and the experiences we had in different countries and working with different clients, the other amazing thing that happened was we discovered on this program were 5 people from Washington, D.C. Um, 4 of us started together. Like, we knew each other, we had decided to go together, and on the program we met a 5th person. So we started, when we came back home and we're trying to make sense of these week-long experiences, we kind of basically started a study group. Like, what the hell's going on? What were they doing? What are these concepts? Paradoxical theory of change, cycle of experience. Can we open our notes again and just read that definition and what do we think it means? And so that was very helpful. So we had this kind of peer group of fellow learners that is still going 9 years later. Next year, I guess, will be our 10th year. We're now a group of about 9 people. So the original 4 of the 5 original iGold people, plus another 4 or 5 of our colleagues who've either done iGold subsequently or have done Gestalt training elsewhere. And we meet monthly. Nowadays, it's sort of online 2 times and in person once a quarter. So that continues to be a strong learning point, continuing to discover, but also supporting each other in our profession.
So that's interesting to me. I started more in sort of like the clinical psychotherapy Gestalt. And there's this other little club, which is the organizational development track. Do you feel like you're part of a Gestalt community, or is it the Gestalt development? Like, how do you experience this connection or intersection or division?
Well, I think of it as intersection.
Okay.
And I'm aware that there is division. So I'll name a division that I'm aware of, but I don't know about the details or have any understanding. But there have been fractures between different Gestalt institutes that previously partnered and now no longer do.
It's the origin story, it's the actual divorce and the literal moving across countries, right?
Right. So it's happened. I don't know why. I don't know the players. It doesn't, in some ways, it doesn't impact me. And my understanding is the story of Gestalt is it starts at that individual level, and then to couples level, right, and family systems. And as it's been told to me, it was the work of, in particular, of Ed Nevis and Sonia Nevis that took it from that sort of intimate family couples environment into organizational systems. Right? So my teachers, Chantel Wiley, John and Kung, Marianne Rainey, John O'Hanifin, all worked closely with and were taught by Ed and Sonia and others. I think of it as the levels of system, right? Starting intrapersonal, then in the dyadic encounter, small group, organization, society, globe, the earth, right? And all of those levels are available to us as both sources of information, data about what's going on, and also as potential points of intervention. Right? And I'm going to say, in many cases, we would need to intervene at multiple levels to bring about sustaining, lasting change. Right? So in the work that I do now, I'm sort of primarily frame myself as an organizational consultant. While my roots back in South Africa in the 90s were about social change, working in communities, et cetera, working in different areas. The way that I see myself making my contribution is I support and help bring about strong, effective organizations that are equipped and capable of doing transformational work in society, right? So I'm not on the front lines of leading change, but I'm supporting and strengthening the people who lead change so that the work can endure, that it's not just successful now, but we're able to keep being successful. So that's where I see myself working. And a lot of my work is working with individuals and working with small groups as a mechanism to change and support change in the organization. Because even small organizations, right? I have one client that's 12 people. I have another client that's 25,000 people. And, so they range things. Almost never can you get the entire organizational system in the room.
Right.
Typically, it's too large, right? Even a group of 12, from their company perspective, that's their large system. But within that, there's a couple of different functional teams, program teams, a leadership team, right? And so you've got to work the different groups and different subgroups to help bring about change. And sometimes that means working with individuals. So in the last couple of years, I've been paying attention to my approach to leadership and executive coaching, getting a little bit more disciplined and robust at it. So it's not just, let's just be in a conversation in the moment, which I was good at, but what's the arc of the coaching relationships and supporting people from their coaching goals through to the conclusion. So we've got to work at all of those, right? Support a leader so that they can show up and effectively lead their team, right? Support the individuals who make up that team, support that team as a system itself, so that it can bring leadership to the organization. Those leaders can each then work with their groups and functions. So you're working at different ways, but always you're working through individuals and groups. And I think that's something that Marianne Rainey has spoken a lot about, and maybe a couple of others, that the group is the means to change. Individuals by themselves can't do it. They can't mobilize and bring the entire system. It's impractical to bring the whole organizational system together as one, but you can work it through multiple small groups. Right? And then linking it back into the therapy piece of it, for individuals, there are times and places when the work that they need to do cannot be supported through coaching. There is the therapeutic work that's needed, right? So one part of it is, the integration for me is that, in a sense, we're partners, right? So you and I could both be working with the same client. You're working with them, deep on their story, on their experience, and all of those things from a therapeutic perspective. I'm supporting them around their leadership and how they're showing up in their context. So that's the one sort of point of integration. The other is, again, I think, looking back at the history, and I'm curious what this looks like today, but looking at the how we as organizational practitioners have benefited from what the therapists learned how to do with individuals and couples and families. That helped us in our individual and dyad and small group work. So there's a sort of I don't know. Certainly there's been a flow that sort of research and experience has benefited us. So it does make me curious about, I wonder if there's a reverse flow.
I think that's exactly where my brain is going. You might be able to actually see it just sort of sitting here chewing on things as you're speaking, but it's because I'm usually the one in a room of more individual therapy focused sort of training settings or groups that talk about that or do that. And I'm sitting in the corner kind of going, but what about the bigger systems?
Yes.
And instead of putting all of that pressure on this pathologized poor little individual,
Right.
just even reminding the individual that they are part of larger systems and finding sort of ways to revive or nourish those connections so that they can draw on it rather than making it all their individual responsibility to climb out of a hole that they did not put themselves in.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Yeah. I mean, the phrase that comes to my mind is context matters.
mhm,
And I heard somebody the other day, what one of my the other areas of great interest is around complexity and complex adaptive systems, which I
mhm,
think actually has a lot of, not parallels, but a lot of similarities with Gestalt, because it's also about it's here and
mhm.
now,
Sort of
and
the
contradicting.
the field theory of,
Yeah,
this and.
right. In this talk, she said something like context is everything. It doesn't just matter, it is everything, right? When I think about my own work with my therapist, um, there's all the inner reflection and all the rest of it. But it's also about me learning to look at what's going on in my context, right? What triggers are there that keep me doing certain things again and again? And so what can I shift in my small micro context to help me have more healthy, effective, adaptive, positive behavior? Right. So if that's true for me at a very, very small level, I think, yeah, paying attention to context matters, and to be aware that I'm intervening here at the individual level. I'm not intervening in your family or that
Mhm,
whatever, but you as an individual are embedded in your context.
mhm,
Those levels of system are your system and your context. And so what's being done through other interventions
mhm.
to adjust the context enough for you to get to a place of more integration.
Yeah, and I'm sort of sitting with these little flashes of, the anthropological perspectives and the traveler perspectives of, there are different ways of doing things, and sometimes individuals are profoundly frustrated and hurt
Right.
because the way they work is in the wrong place at the wrong time. And
Yeah.
we don't always know that there are other systems doing things in other ways in other places.
Right.
Hmm.
Yeah. And so I think, that's sort of been my, again, sort of the gift to me of this life experience is traveling and entering different societies, different cultures, bringing with me my own awareness of, oh, there's other ways of doing it, not just the way that it's here. And then, as an adult and as a professional, being able to say, okay, so um, you're focusing on this thing here. What I can bring from my broader experience is this other element to it,
Mhm.
right? To add, to bring flavor to what you're working on.
Mhm.
Um, so I can value my own contributions, and again, it helps me be sensitive to, and what else do other people here have to bring that they're not bringing,
Mhm.
and how can we create a space in which they're invited in to bring these contributions.
Mhm. Yeah, rather than teaching to test, to do things to your expected outcomes, right?
Right, right.
Hmm, interesting. I, I'm sort of sitting here feeling like a lot of the points of the conversation are intersecting in this. I'm wondering, is there anything else that you feel like you would like to add or mention?
Well, I think, for me, the iGold experience, which I did 2014, 2015, was transformational, right? And then took me several years to really get the full benefit from it,
Mhm,
right? To kind of unlearn some habits that were not helping me, where I was more relying on technique rather than on um, being in the moment, being more able to work with what's going on here and now. So I'm in a space today where I feel really excited about the work that I do. I work with some amazing clients. Many of them are nonprofits, social sector organizations, foundations that are doing some really, really significant work in the world. I work also corporate organizations, again, but broadly people who are doing things that matter in the world. So I like to feel that I'm a part of something bigger. I work with an amazing group of colleagues. I learn from them. They support me in helping me be able to do things. I very, very rarely work alone with a client. I'm normally bringing in at least one other person, maybe more. And so I feel that I'm sort of just getting up to speed, right? I'm sort of really curious and excited about what the next 10, 15 years are going to bring for me in my experience and my practice.
Do you have any idea or any intention?
That's interesting. So I've always struggled with long-term planning.
I wonder why. Instability, maybe?
Yeah. I mean, it was interesting. When I moved into the city of Durban, and I remember renting my apartment. This was when I was starting to work with Olive, and I kind of literally the day I moved in, I was standing in this place. The boxes are still unpacked, and I thought, oh, I don't know when I'm going to leave here.
It's not a
And
countdown.
it was like how old would I be? 26, 27. And it was this may not have been strictly true, but it was my sense of this is the first time I'm going into somewhere, not knowing how long I have before I'm going to move to somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
So, so if you were to look at my calendar, you might see things up to 3 months ahead. Right. But sort of,
I don't think that qualifies as long term.
well, it depends on your perspective.
Okay.
My family will sort of having conversations about summer holidays of summer of 2024 and Christmas of 2024. It's like, oh, that's such a long way away from that. I've got no idea.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. So as I think about these next 15 years, which it was very interesting. Again, this year I turned 55. On the day of my birthday, I had this flash that said, I've just completed two 15-year cycles of work over the last 30 years, and there's 15 more ahead of me. So I thought, oh, so doing some form of work to about age 70. So I thought, oh, that's really interesting. 15 years. Oh. So that was my first ever really time of like having a time frame, because otherwise it was sort of retirement would be at some point.
Abstract. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm in the here and now, and I still feel that. But I think what I see myself doing, I've seen over time that I have become more effective and more impactful in my work with clients.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like at one point, the progression was, my clients are program managers. Then my clients are program directors. Then my clients were vice presidents.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And now my clients are CEOs and executive directors. So there's a sort of a seniority of the leaders I'm working with,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of an elevating of the size of the system that we're working with.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So now I'm very comfortable working with leaders, CEOs, and organization whole systems. So I see myself continuing to do that, and getting ever better at it. And then I also see, this is sort of potentially sort of a winding down strategy, of sort of shifting a portfolio from less group level work towards more individual work.
Mm-hmm.
So more executive leadership coaching. which would then give me flexibility. It doesn't have to be full-time. It doesn't have to be done from this place here. I can be anywhere in the world and still be coaching people. So that I'm not in this fixed, I have to have a 9 to 5 work until I retire, and then it's nothing. It's the blend and the portfolio and the joy, which is of being self-employed, is I can be flexible and be with family things when that's needed, and be on working on myself and be working with clients and be learning all of moving all of that along.
That sounds like a lovely plan.
Such as it is.
Well, I mean, there's just a Mexican saying, which is, if you want to make God laugh, make plans. But I really truly hope it does work out for you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm feeling excited about the potential that's there. Yeah. It's got no definition to it. The figure hasn't emerged from the ground, they might say, in some places.
Yes, the theory and the practice will play out. But
it will.
That sounds lovely, though. All right. Well, I don't feel like I have any questions left in me for you right now. I've really enjoyed sort of following these different little threads through your story and your thought processes. So thank you. I don't know if you have anything final that you wanted to say, or is it okay for you if we sort of wrap this one up here?
So there's one thing that's in my awareness now that we haven't spoken much about, which is around identity in relation to race.
Okay.
I had spoken about some of my experiences in South Africa in my university days, where I was kind of learning how to do things. And again, I think it's partly about how I look at power and how I can use my power for good. But it's also about, in today's world, one of the things I've had to realize is that I live in the United States, right? I've had to learn US history.
Yes.
Which is actually quite hard to do, because the surface level is probably known around the world, right? Because of Hollywood and all that.
Difficult to get reliable historical information about US history.
But I want to say only in the last maybe 5 years have I begun to understand this phrase of the Reconstruction, which was a period of time in the 1870s after the Civil War, which was profoundly important in terms of empowering formerly enslaved people, particularly in the South, exercising voting rights, beginning to exercise economic power, and then how that got squashed by the dominant white capitalist structures, right? So that Black people then got stripped of those rights, and the so-called Jim Crow period came about. I didn't understand that, having lived in this country for more than 15 years as a historically curious person who looks at linkages and systems and context, right? So I didn't understand that. So it's like, not at all surprising that most Americans don't understand it, because it doesn't get taught in a way that there's an awareness of their racial history. So now I've been having to learn these things, and now I'm working with colleagues who are people of color. I have clients who are people of color, and I've been relearning what of my early South African experiences in the 90s, where we were working to be more racially conscious, working towards equity. How does that inform what I'm doing now? And how is now different? Because it's 30 years later, of course it's going to be different. But, I can't just say, oh, well, I was a good person back in the 90s and, we had a integrated workplace. Therefore, I'm good to go for today, because that's no longer true. Right. So, so how am I noticing, when I'm in a space that might be harder for a person of color to operate? So I can work for, support, creating spaces for them and their voices. How am I learning from them? Right. One of my long colleagues, an iGold participant, woman of color, she's a few years older than me. I've been working with her on a couple of different projects over the last probably 6-7 years. I'm the junior, right? We go into these meetings, I'm the sole white male, right? Otherwise, it's people of color, woman. And, I'm aware that I'm not in charge, right? And I'm very comfortable with that. I'm not feeling like, oh, this is so difficult for me to not be running the show. But I also have a sense of it's actually not a very common experience for white American males to be in a space in which, as the only white person, as the only male, they're not in charge.
Well, it's that kind of entitlement to fill up the space allowed.
Right. Right. And I will still do that because I'm human and because I have blind spots and biases and all the rest of it. But I'm learning to become more aware of them. And this, I think, is where the cycle of experience is actually such a useful frame. Because, the first two pieces, sensation and awareness, right? Got to absolutely have those to bring about change. You can't make people change because of logic, because of facts, right? So it's got to come into their awareness. But then the next critical point is, can they mobilize energy to start to do something about it? Because if they can, then you've got a much better chance of completing the cycle of experience. But if they either are in sensation and don't get any awareness from it, or they get to awareness, but it's so uncomfortable that they retreat back into, I'd rather not, then nothing's going to happen. So, in some ways, paradoxically, I welcome being uncomfortable, right? It's not always comfortable by definition, but I know that's the place where I'm curious about something interesting is going to happen that will help me learn something more or be useful for others.
Well, it's sort of finding that point of contrast or differentiation and novelty, right? I mean, more of the same is not enriching.
Yeah. And so I think, that's actually interesting. It goes back to the early university days, right? Majority white students, few black students, you're welcome to join us. But as the numbers grow, as the power dynamic begins to shift, and we're not willing to give up how we do things, or we'll only have that token one song in Zulu that we'll all mispronounce because we actually never learned how to speak Zulu living in South Africa all those years, and then we'll be surprised when people want to separate because we're not willing to do the hard work of how do we change how we do things.
It's not actually in to be felt as discomfort and change.
Right. And actually, that was for me the key reason why Trevor Gorvin and the student YMCA was able to do this work effectively. It was new. It didn't have habits and practices that had to be unlearned. We started as a racially inclusive group and grappled with what does that mean and how do we do this? Because none of us have ever done this before. But it was very different from, a white dominant group that's now trying to work out, do we let others in? On what terms do we let them in? How much of what we do are we willing to change to, let them just be on the margins? Or
it sounds like a very, very clear difference between, a truly creative process, a collaborative, co-creative process, and this fixed gestalt of we already have a way, but this is how we do things.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is actually really interesting because I haven't thought about this connection back to those early experiences. So again, for me, the good fortune is I had those experiences. They were
Mhm.
uncomfortable. There was tension and conflict and misunderstandings, but I at least had something to look back to as a point of comparison.
Mhm.
And I learned some things that I'm, still able to use today as I learn from, seek to be humble and uncomfortable and learn from my colleagues.
Mhm.
And again, that thing of integration.
I come back to, as a parent, thanking your parents, whether they knew what they were doing or not, for that willingness to make your whole family radically uncomfortable in this novelty, immersion, travel kind of model. I think those are really foundational experiences because it's
They
sort
are.
of about how much are you able to stretch and learn, and that plasticity, that adaptability as a child is completely different, than a traveling adult who's more of a set unit.
Right, right.
Hmm.
Yeah. So that's what came up for me in response to your last question.
Well, thank you. I
And now
appreciate
I'm feeling complete.
it. Okay. Wonderful. Well, I'm definitely glad that you didn't, have rehearsed prefabricated answers. This was much more enjoyable. So
And yeah,
thank
I
you.
enjoyed it. Thank you, Heather.
Yeah. All right. Well, we will stop this one here.